free of jokes. I really cannot think of many Magna Carta jokes. Tell you, they just don't exist. A bit awkward, that. So, I will play it straight. And what I will do first of all is tell you a little bit about how Magna Carta was made, the backstory to it in the run-up to 1215, and more particularly, how Magna Carta came to be made permanent. Because Magna Carta, in the form that we're celebrating next year, had a shelf life of just 3 months. How Magna Carta came to be made permanent is an interesting story, and that belongs to the reign of the next king, Henry III. Second thing I will do, more specifically on the question of why celebrate, is address the question of what has Magna Carta done for me? What has Magna Carta done for you? Thirdly, I want to balance that by a word or two about the limitations to the achievement of Magna Carta. Because, of course, there are some. And then, fourthly, and pretty well the last, balancing that in turn, how has the achievement of Magna Carta become enshrined? And that actually takes us onto the history of Parliament. And then a few concluding observations, if time allows. Now, to begin with, how did Magna Carta come to be made in June 1215? We are, of course, talking about the reign of Bad King John. And he was Bad King John. I think all attempts to rehabilitate King John, and many attempts have been made by historians to rehabilitate King John, they are all doomed to inevitable failure. He is and was beyond hope. But it's not just a matter of his personality, and he was pretty unpleasant. He was slippery, treacherous, a womanizer. He was awful, but worst of all, he was a loser. In the fullest sense, he was a loser. And what mattered most in the Middle Ages was being a loser in war. And that showed up all the more by contrast with his predecessor, who was Richard the Lionheart, his elder brother, who was the greatest soldier of the age. And I don't want to get involved on Richard the Lionheart now, but I do think he was an outstandingly a very great man. And John's inadequacy showed up by comparison with his elder brother. Now you'll probably be aware that John, Richard the Lionheart, and Henry II, their father before them, were not just kings of England. They were rulers of a vast area of Western France, known as the Angevin Empire. In fact, in the 12th century, the King Dukes of England and Normandy ruled more of the present-day France than the kings of France themselves did. And the long-standing ambition of the kings of France was to kick the Angevins out of France. Kick them out and sever the link between England and Normandy. And Philip Augustus of France finally achieved that aim in 1204. John lost the greater part of his lands in France. All that was left to him was Aquitaine down in the southwest. Now that, of course, was an appalling humiliation. Even John felt it. And he directed all of his efforts over the 10 years to come to trying to get those lands back. And it's that struggle which forms the backcloth to Magna Carta, because it was massively expensive, both in money and in manpower. It all built up in the year 1214 to a projected two-pronged attack on France. It was good armchair strategy. It looked brilliant on paper. John himself was going to go down to Bordeaux and Aquitaine and attack France from the bottom. And his ally, the Emperor of Germany, was going to attack from the east, from Germany through Flanders. And France would collapse between the two prongs of the invasion. As I say, it was good armchair strategy. And you can see what I'm going to lead up to. It was a dismal failure. The King of France left John to himself and concentrated his efforts on repelling the Emperor of Germany. And he was defeated at a very important battle, so important it's completely forgotten now, but a few aficionados celebrated it a few months ago, July 1214, the Battle of Bouvines. God Worcester went there. The Battle of Bouvines was one of those battles which was a turning point in Western history. The King of France massively defeated the Emperor, and that sealed the fate of John's attempts to recover Normandy. It was all over. But what I want to say to you is the bills still had to be paid. And it was when John, like Caesar Augustus, going out to order the whole world to be taxed, when John sent his taxes out across England in the autumn of 1215, that was what sparked the disaffection that built up 8 months later to the meeting at Runnymede. And the stages of the rebellion are well charted, and you've got all crucial dates on your handout. It began as a tax rebellion in the north of England. The hardline opponents of King John were known to contemporaries as the Northerners. The Northerners. They made an alliance with the leading barons of East Anglia. And just over 800 years ago, in October 1214, they met at Bury St Edmunds. The northern and the eastern barons met at Bury St Edmunds Abbey. And there they swore an oath to secure justice from King John. If you know Bury St Edmunds, there's a 19th century memorial tablet on the Abbey ruins recalling that event. It is etched into the civic memory of the town of Bury St Edmunds. And it's why Bury St Edmunds is one of the towns involved in this anniversary. In January, they had a meeting with King John himself at the Temple Church in London. That got nowhere. And then, in April, probably at Stony Stratford, the barons renounced homage to the king. That was the way in which, in the feudal world of the early 13th century, you legitimised rebellion against the king. You renounced your oaths of homage to him and declared war on him because he was no longer your good lord. The turning point in the struggle came on the 17th of May, when London opened its gates to the rebels. And that put them in business. They had access to the money bags of the capital. It mattered then. London had the money bags then as now. It put the barons in business. And that told John that he would have to negotiate. John, at that time, was at Odium in Hampshire, another of the towns enthusiastically involved in our anniversary celebrations. On the 1st of June, he returned from Odium to Windsor. And the barons at that point, by that time, their advance guard had moved from London to Staines. Where on earth they found to stay in Staines, God only knows. But the point is, you see, Runnymede is halfway between Windsor, where the king was, and Staines, then is now a major bridging point over the river, the 830, where the barons were. And what you have to imagine, in the first 2 weeks of June, between the 1st and the 15th, is shuttle diplomacy between the two sides, with someone or a group of people doing the kind of job that the US Secretary of State does today in shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. And it's not too difficult, I think, to see the man who was doing much of that shuttle diplomacy as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, one of the leading intellectuals of the age, and a man, I think, whose ideas fed into the making of the Charter. And we know that by the 10th of June, a provisional settlement was made. And that is a document called the Articles of the Barons, which is a very close draft of the final terms of the Charter. It's up the road in the British Library in London, in Euston Road, and it will be on show in their exhibition, which begins next March. The Articles of the Barons, 10th of June, closely foreshadows the final terms. The next 5 days were fine-tuning. And then the final terms were agreed by the 15th, and on the 15th, then, as it will be next year, a Monday, very nice coincidence, some sort of peacemaking ceremony took place there. We don't know exactly what. We don't have any eyewitness accounts. No person who was there have left us an account of what happened. But it was a peacemaking ceremony, and Scott, can I borrow you for a moment? Peacemaking ceremonies in the Middle Ages literally took this short sort of shape, hugging, and then I won't do the kissing bit, otherwise I'll get arrested and taken away. But they exchanged the kiss of peace. I haven't finished with you, mate. Then on the 19th, the Friday, a further ceremony took place, kneel down before me, and that was the renewal of the oath of homage. And each of the barons would have knelt down like that and placed his hands between those of the king, like that. Thank you very much. That was the renewal of the oath of homage. Because remember, as I said a moment ago, the way in which in a feudal society you legitimised an act of rebellion was renouncing homage. So on the 19th, there's a letter that says, the letter to Stephen Haringey, King John says this, on the Friday, the barons renewed their oaths of homage, which is what I've just done with Scott. So, the peacemaking ceremonies, you see, were spread over a whole week. And at the end of the week, the barons would have chosen their famous committee of enforcers, the Committee of 25. Then they all went home. So, one way of reading Magna Carta, it was an instrument that made possible the renewal of feudal homage, and it was a peace treaty bringing an end to a period of civil war between the king and the barons that had erupted the previous autumn. It was a peace, one of the shortest pieces ever. It lasted just 3 months. Now, when they all went their separate ways on the Friday, do you honestly think the barons supposed that King John would abide by this document? Of course not. They weren't dumb, they weren't stupid. They'd been living with this man for 16 years. Of course they knew King John couldn't be trusted. That's why they'd set up the enforcement committee of 25 barons who enforced the damn thing, because they knew that King John would have to be watched. So they were right to be suspicious of the king. Because, of course, as soon as he got back to Windsor, he was determined to tear the whole thing up. Now, in the Middle Ages, when you'd sworn a solemn oath and made a peacemaking ceremony, how could you tear a document up? How could you tear up Magna Carta? Because, as I've just said, in some sense, it was a peace treaty. The answer is, you went to the Pope. And you said to the Pope, "My Lord Pope, I was forced to take this oath under duress. Therefore it has no validity in the eyes of God." And remember, of course, John also said to the Pope, "I will become a crusader. I will go on crusade. I'd go now if it wasn't for these annoying, rebellious barons." And Innocent III swallowed all of this and released the king from his oath. So he tore it up. That was in September, 3 months after Runnymede, and England was plunged back into civil war. And that is the end of the first part of the story of Magna Carta. It had a shelf life of just 3 months. So, how did Magna Carta come to be made permanent? And that story takes us on to the next reign. Now, in the light of these appalling circumstances, King John did the best thing, the very best thing that he could have done in the circumstances, he died. October 1216, shortly after losing his laundry in the wash, at Newark Castle, he died. And that was doubly fortuitous, because his son and heir, new king, the young Henry III, was a boy of just age 9 years. And of course you could not visit the sins of the father on the son. He was innocent, he was blameless, it wasn't his fault. That immediately created the conditions in which a new settlement, could be made. Unfortunately, in England at the time, there were two men with the imagination and the ability to seize the opportunity. And those men, one name will be known to you, I think, the other one won't. One man was William Marshall, great Marshall, the Earl of Pembroke, who's buried up the road in the Temple Church. He's the one you'll have heard of. The other one you won't, and that's the papal legate, War, the Pope's representative in England. And he also was a very fine man. And what the two of them did between them was take the original Magna Carta, the document of June 1215, and shred it of all its most contentious and controversial clauses. Because let me say, it was a very partisan document. It was very much what the barons imposed on John. And many of its clauses were specific to John's reign. Now you see, with John out of the way, all of that could be shredded, it could be deleted. So they slimmed Magna Carta down. Slimmed it down from 63 clauses to 30-something. And reissued it as the new king's peace offering to his subjects. They did that for the first time in November 1216. The trick did not work then, because the country was still at war. But they did it again the following year, after the baronial forces had been defeated in the field at Lincoln. And this time it worked. November 1217, it worked. And that version of Magna Carta became the basis of a new political dispensation, the peace settlement between the king and the barons. It was reissued yet again in 1225, when Henry III came of age. And it's that version, final version, 1225, which is the version of Magna Carta that famously is the foundation stone of the Constitution, the first statute on our statute book. It was that version of the Charter, 1225, which was launched on its career as the first statute on the statute book. So the answer to the question, how did it become permanent, is a story that's an achievement of the minority years of King Henry III. And it's the result of the imagination of those two men, Marshall and Guare. So, let me now, with all that done, and the dates are on the handout, go on to my second theme, which is, why is Magna Carta so celebrated? What's its great achievement? What's it done for all of us in this room? And I think I can answer that question very simply by saying that what Magna Carta did, and why we're all celebrating it, is that it established the principle that executive authority is under the law. It placed the king under the law. When we say the king, today we can say government, executive authority, the prime minister is under the law. Now, to put that in its context, let me, you can bear with me for a few minutes, say a word or two about late 12th, early 17th century political ideas. Because this whole question, at the time, what is the relationship between the king and the law? It was much debated, and the answer wasn't by any means clear. One view, the view of the king and the royalists, was that the king is above the law. And intellectually, this was a very tenable and persuasive point of view. Because their view was, the king doesn't get his authority to rule from us, from you. The king gets his authority to rule from God, mediated by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the coronation ceremony, when the king is touched on the head and the shoulders with holy oil, invested with some of the attributes of the priest, and set apart from his subjects and from other ordinary mortals. The king gets his authority to rule from God and is answerable only to God. Not to us, not to you, answerable only to God. And then only on the day of judgment. Right? So the king is above the law. The king enforces the law, but he's above the law, because he's answerable only to God. Now the other view, the view of the intellectuals in Paris and other places, to whom perhaps Stephen Langton might have belonged, took a rather different view. Their view was that most law is God's law, what in the jargon of the day they called natural law. It is out there, it is immanent, it existed before we all do, and the job of a king was to discover it and interpret it and enforce it. And since it's God's law, and we are all under God, the king is under it. So according to that view, the king was under the law. So how do you, well, those are extreme points of view. The problem was that in England, by the beginning of the 13th century, there was a large grey area in between. And that large grey area was man-made. Because kingship in England in the late 12th, early 13th century was a very dynamic force. Kings were not only enforcing law, they were creating law. John's father, Henry II, had been one of the great lawmakers of English history. What was the relationship between the king and man-made? Was he bound by that? Or you get this was a difficult and complex area, and it challenged the finest minds of the day. Now, what I want to say to you is that Magna Carta settled that argument, because collectively, through its 63 clauses, enforced by the Committee of 25, and by those two famous clauses, 39 and 40, Magna Carta established clearly that the king is under the law. Clause 39 and clause 40, you've got them on the handout. Now, the most famous ones, and the clauses that resonate over the centuries. Clause 39, no free man shall be imprisoned, seized, etc., against the law of the land or without judgment of his peers. Clause 40, to no one shall seldom may or deny right or justice. They are two of 4 clauses of the Charter that are still on the statute book today. And what they did was subject kingship to the law. And this is the point that Bracton, the great jurist, made in the 13th century in his law textbook. Bracton said in the reign of Henry III, next generation, in England, the king is below God and below the law. Settled that one once and for all. Now, of course, it was a bumpy ride in the years ahead. I won't say it was immediately accepted, but the principle was enshrined there in Magna Carta. It's a key turning point. Now, if that's the great achievement of Magna Carta, and we're all agreed it's why we're meeting this evening, it's why we're going to be celebrating this document in June 1215, what more is there to be said? We all pack up and go home. Now, there is, of course, lots of buts. There's a downside. And may I, point number 3, go on to that. What was the limitation to the achievement of Magna Carta? Because indeed, there was a limitation. And the limitation of Magna Carta was this. Magna Carta was very much a product of its time. It was of its period, of its age. It offered a specific set of grievances. It offered a specific set of remedies to a specific set of grievances. It was of its time. Let me draw a contrast with the American Declaration of Independence, drafted by Jefferson. And Jefferson was a great wordsmith. That has magnificent phrases, doesn't it? Broad generalities that resonate over the centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and so on. You don't really find these great ringing phrases in Magna Carta. Nearest you get to them is clause 39. Nearest you get is clause 39. If you read Magna Carta, I think a lot of young people read Magna Carta. They're slightly disappointed. Because what's it all about? Clause 2, reliefs shall be set at £100 for a barony, 100 shillings for a knight's fee. No disparagement of widows. What on earth does disparagement mean? These poor old widows. It's all feudal nitty-gritty. My favourite is clause 33. No fish weighers on the River Thames. Oh, and the River Medway. Let's not leave out the River Medway. That was actually, to the long term, to be a very important and significant clause. There's a gay free passage along the rivers. But you take my point. It's a document of its age. Everybody who got a grievance against King John, and by God there was a long queue of them by 1250, fed in his grievance into Magna Carta. It's a classic committee job. And the various grievances, the various clauses, they didn't even bother arranging them in any particular order. It's a ragbag. It's a collection of remedies designed to remedy a particular set of grievances. Everybody coming forward in June 1215. Are you getting the point I want to make here? That once John had died, once the grievances, the problems, the controversies of John's reign had passed away, Magna Carta was beginning to look dated. In 1250, 1300, it was obsolete. It was becoming an anachronism. As early as the 14th century, people were looking at it, reading its clauses, scratching their heads, and saying, what is all this about? What's it got to do with me? Magna Carta rapidly became obsolete. And in due course, of course, stage by stage, its clauses were abrogated. Not till a lot later. But this was the penalty for obsolescence. So what you see happening is when you come on to Henry III's reign, Edward II's reign, Richard II's reign, all these later reigns, when there was a crisis between king and barons, when the barons wanted to achieve a new settlement with the king, what they said was, the first thing, you must confirm Magna Carta. They all said that. They all said to the king, first thing you've got to do is confirm Magna Carta. But, secondly, we're going to build on Magna Carta by asking for a new lot of concessions, a new charter. And then eventually, when they got fed up with kings altogether and gave up any hope of reforming, of course what they did was murder them. So by the 15th century, Magna Carta, you hear less and less of Magna Carta. When you had an unsatisfactory king in the 15th century, the Wars of the Roses, what did you do with him? You murdered him. What did Magna Carta do to help the victims of Richard III? Nothing. What did Magna Carta do to help the victims of Henry VIII? Nothing. You see the problem with Magna Carta? It was symbolic. It actually offered people in later centuries no practical solutions because it was of its time. It breathed the air of feudalism. It was born of a feudal society. It offered remedies to feudal grievances. By the 14th, the 15th, and 16th century, England, a new dynamic society, had left the age of feudalism well behind. So, what are we to make of Magna Carta? Is its importance actually exaggerated? Much exaggerated. And is it the case that actually, under the cold light of analysis, it offered no great protections to anybody? Well, of course, there is an answer to that. And what I want you to do now, on the handout, is to consider two clauses of Magna Carta that we haven't considered so far. We go on to paragraph number 3, Magna Carta and the origins of Parliament. Because let me anticipate this by saying that next year, as I said right at the beginning, that will be a rich in anniversaries. Next year, 2015, we are also celebrating the 750th anniversary of the Simon de Montfort Parliament in 1265. There is an integral connection between Magna Carta and the origins of Parliament. Very convenient for us in the anniversary industry that the 800th of Magna Carta falls in the same year as the 750th of the Simon de Montfort Parliament. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us see what the Magna Carta connection is first. And in the 1215 version of the Charter, Clause 12, no scutage or aid may be levied without common council. Scutage is money in lieu of military service. Aid is a fancy feudal word for taxation. What Clause 12 effectively says, in Thomas Jefferson language, in American colonists' language, is no taxation without representation. If you are looking for a document in English history where that principle is written down and affirmed for the first time, it is here in Clause 12 of Magna Carta. No scutage or aid without common council, translated into modern language, means no taxation without representation. And then, in Clause 14, they go on to say how that council is to be obtained, how that consent is to be obtained. To obtain common consent for an aid, a tax, we will have archbishops, bishops, abbots and earls summoned individually by our letters, and we will summon by our sheriffs and bailiffs all of those who hold of us directly in chief, giving them 40 days notice. What they were saying there was that if you're one of the good and great of the realm, if you're an archbishop, a bishop, or if you're a baron, you'll get your invitation to a meeting of Parliament, let us call it Parliament. You'll get your invitation, your letter of summons, in the post. But if you're a lesser tenant, if you're an ordinary knight, you will be summoned by the local county sheriff. The summonses will be channeled through the sheriff. The word Parliament is nowhere mentioned in Magna Carta because Parliament did not exist at the time of Magna Carta. That's why it's not mentioned. The phraseology they use is common council. The first recorded usage of the word Parliament comes in the next reign, that of Henry III, in 1236. That is to say, just 20 years after Magna Carta. There, for the first time, we get the word Parliament. Parler, French, to speak, a talking shop. There is a direct connection between these clauses in Magna Carta, enshrining the principle of consent and the origins of Parliament. And what I want to say to you, of course, is that if we ask the question, how is it in English history, taking the broad view, that the rights of the individual against the state have been entrenched, successfully entrenched, it is through parliamentary legislation. Now, it takes no effort to sketch out in broad terms the process by which this came about. And I think most of us are familiar with it. Remember, we're talking about the Middle Ages. We're talking about a world of kings. What did kings do? What did kings do most of all? What did they like doing most? They liked doing most what Richard the Lionheart was so triumphantly successful at. Fighting, making war. In the late Middle Ages, why did they make war? Well, against the Scots and the Welsh in the 13th century, that they had a bloody nose off the Scots at Bannockburn. In the 14th and 15th century, what attracted them, of course, was France, the 100 Years' War. Far more enjoyable and attractive and successful in Scotland. Nice wines there. Better record and success in battle. War. And war was expensive. It had to be paid for, and that meant levying taxes. So what you find in the late Middle Ages, from the 13th century onwards, is kings needing taxation, needing the authority to tax their subjects, to pay for war. And taxation required consent. We are not dealing with an Oriental tyranny here. We are dealing in many ways with a limited monarchy. You couldn't just go out and tax arbitrarily. You couldn't do that. That's theft. The way you legitimise theft from the pocket is by getting consent to it in Parliament. So in order to fight wars, our kings needed to obtain consent to taxation. Where did they obtain consent to taxation? From Parliament, from what was to be a bicameral institution, just as described here in clause 14. The great men of the realm, the bishops, archbishops, earls and barons, who had their individual summonses in the post, they made up, of course, the future House of Lords. And the country bumpkin knights, who are summoned through the sheriff, they are the embryonic nucleus of the future House of Commons. And when the king, through his chancellor, in his keynote speech, asked the meeting of Parliament for a grant of taxation to the king, to pay for a campaign in France, Commons and the Lords, particularly the Commons, of course, said, "Well, my Lord King, before we make you our grant of taxation, we want you first of all to remedy our grievances." And what they would then do is draw up what they called a common petition, all-embracing petition, listing their grievances, on which they wanted remedy from the king, which they would give to the Chancellor to pass on to the king, and then the king, a few days or a few weeks later, would reply to them, giving his replies, offering redress of grievance, and then the Commons would make their grant of taxation. And that is how the principles of Magna Carta, steadily, incrementally over the centuries, were translated into law by trading the subject's need for redress of grievance against the king's need for taxation. It's called, of course, the power of the purse strings. And you see this process happening all the way through, from the 14th century through to the 17th. You see in the year 1353, the so-called Six Acts, a whole series of minor provisions of Magna Carta being condensed into a petition, the king giving his assent to that petition and being enacted as law. And most famously, in the year 1679, in the reign of King Charles II, the principle of clause 39, no one can be arrested, was enacted in the famous Habeas Corpus Act. What Habeas Corpus in 1679 did was give very precise legislative enactment to clause 39 of Magna Carta. And then finally, in the Great Revolutionary Settlement of 1688-89, when James II was overthrown and William and Mary brought in and made joint monarchs, in a series of enactments in the settlement of the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, Parliament collectively turned itself into an executive authority over and above the king, effectively there giving expression to the principle that the law is above the monarch. So I would say to you that the paradox we have in this country is that the principles of Magna Carta, yes, they did triumph, but they triumphed through the work of Parliament, an institution, not a written document, which helps to explain what I think is one of the central paradoxes of English constitutional history, which is that in Magna Carta we gave the world, effectively, its first written constitution. Or, let me put it this way, the world's first permanent written constitution, the Magna Carta of 1225. It was, I'm stretching it a little bit for the sake of rhetorical effect's sake, but Magna Carta of 1225, the basic law of the kingdom, can be seen at a stretch as the world's first written constitution. And yet, of course, at the same time, we take pride in the fact we haven't got a written constitution in this country. Simon Boxall wrote a very good article in the Times yesterday saying, Britain needs a written constitution. And yet, I know what Vernon means, but in a sense, you can say from the historian's perspective, Magna Carta is our basic law. It is a sort of written constitution. Yet we take pride. We're different from everywhere. The other countries, they've got written constitutions. We don't. We've managed without them. Because what we cherish, what Enoch Powell's used to go on about 30, 40 years ago, we cherish the sovereignty of Parliament. And the explanation for that is that through this process of historical development, it is actually, one has to say this, through the sovereignty of Parliament, that the principles of Magna Carta have acquired permanence. Well, just to round off, a few observations. I said I'd do about 3/4 of an hour, we're coming up to 3/4 of an hour. How may we draw these various strings together? There is no doubt that even though Magna Carta was of its time, the product of a specific set of historical circumstances, and for that reason became dated, despite that, Magna Carta quickly acquired enormous symbolic significance. This is its true importance. It acquired enormous symbolic importance, which I think makes it difficult to capture in an exhibition. I look forward to seeing how the British Library do this. How do you capture the magic of a document? If you look at Magna Carta, if you go to Lincoln, the British Library, Salisbury, look at Magna Carta, it's a crap bit of parchment, like that, not much bigger than this, in Latin, hardly anybody can read it, in funny handwriting, even fewer people can read it. How do you capture the magic of that in an exhibition? Very difficult to do. And yet, magic, I exaggerate only a little, is what this document had. It acquired, to use that overused word today, iconic significance. It had enormous symbolic power. And you see that as early as the 13th century. Because within a few years of the Great Charter, you see subjects bringing litigation cases to the King's Courts, saying, I'm bringing this into court because so-and-so did something, the Sheriff of Lincolnshire did something which contravened Magna Carta. This is a real case. In the court of Kesteven in Lincolnshire, in the early years of Henry III's reign, a group of litigants brought a case alleging that the Sheriff of Lincolnshire had violated the terms of Magna Carta. It acquired huge symbolic significance. It provided a touchstone of good government. As I said, over the centuries, of course a lot of kings were bandits, of course they played fast and loose with the law, of course they did. But people could always cite Magna Carta against it. And at no period was that more important than in the 17th century. Because when I said earlier, Magna Carta was dying the death by the time of the appalling Richard III and Henry VIII. It was revived, and new life was breathed into it in the reign of Charles I. And it formed, of course, the basis for the Petition of Right of 1628. It was revived as a weapon with which to counter and challenge the absolutist tendencies of the early Stuart monarchs. And then in the 18th century, it was carried across the Atlantic to the United States. And then it was used as a weapon with which to beat the governments of King George III. Across the world, it has been valued as a beacon of freedom, a document of iconic significance, a touchstone of good government, something that would make dictators quake in their boots. That is its significance, symbolic, out of all proportion to the individual clauses of the document itself. When we fixed the date for this meeting this evening, and I just jotted it in my diary, it was months ago last year, wasn't it, Jane? November the 11th, 2014. Of course, at that time, I don't think any of us realised the significance of the day. But isn't it a good coincidence that we are meeting today on the 11th day of the 11th month in the very year when we celebrate the outbreak, the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War, and when, as we did at 11 this morning, we remembered the dead of 2 world wars. What a fortunate coincidence. Because it is when we think about Magna Carta, we realise what it was that all those brave men gave their lives for. They were fighting for freedom. And in this country, the history of that story of freedom begins here with this document agreed at Runnymede 800 years ago.
Can you just explain to us the term free man?
Oh yeah, good one.
What was